Jasmine Washington stands frozen in the first-class aisle as the white businessman, Harold Bennett, demands she be removed from his section. Flight attendant Kevin approaches. Just as Kevin begins to speak, Jasmine quietly reveals something from her uniform pocket. Harold's face drains of color. Before we dive into this incredible story, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever witnessed someone being put in their place after showing prejudice. Let's see what happened next in this jaw-dropping encounter. The day had started like any other for Jasmine Washington. Her alarm blared at 4:30 a.m., and she rose from her bed in her modest Atlanta apartment with practiced efficiency. The walls of her bedroom told the story of a dream pursued relentlessly, framed photos of her first solo flight, her graduation from flight school, and her proudly standing beside an Atlantic Airways jet in her captain's uniform. As she showered, Jasmine's mind drifted to her childhood in Memphis, Tennessee. She was just 7 years old when her father took her to an airshow. The moment she saw a plane soaring through the clouds, performing impossible maneuvers with grace and precision, something clicked inside her. "I want to do that, Daddy," she had said, pointing at the sky. Her father had squeezed her hand and replied, "Then you will, Jazzy. You'll have to work twice as hard as everyone else, but you will." Those words had proven prophetic. Flight school had been a gauntlet of challenges. In her class of 35 students, she was one of only 3 women and the only black person. Instructors scrutinized her performance with extra rigor, peers questioned her abilities, and she often found herself isolated during study groups and social gatherings. "You don't look like a pilot," was a phrase she'd heard so many times it had lost its sting. Almost. The truth was, it still hurt, but she'd mastered the art of not showing it. Jasmine's morning routine was meticulous, a necessity in her profession where precision meant safety. Her uniform was always impeccably pressed, her shoes polished to a mirror shine, her natural hair styled in a neat, professional bun. Today, she added her 4 gold stripes to her epaulettes with particular care. As the youngest black female captain at Atlantic Airways, she knew her appearance would be scrutinized more than her white male counterparts. Her phone buzzed as she was applying a minimal amount of makeup. It was Travis Reynolds, her co-pilot for today's flight. "Morning, Captain," Travis's cheerful voice came through the speaker. "Just got word from dispatch. We've got some schedule changes for today's flight to Chicago." "What's the situation?" Jasmine asked, already mentally recalculating her day. "Departure pushed back 30 minutes due to air traffic congestion at O'Hare. And heads up, we've got some VIPs on board. Airline executives flying back after the regional conference." Jasmine nodded to herself. "Thanks for the heads up, Travis. See you at the briefing." After ending the call, Jasmine grabbed her flight bag and captain's hat. As she locked her apartment door, her neighbor, an older white man named Gerald, emerged from his unit. "Off to your stewardess job?" he asked with what he probably thought was friendly interest. Jasmine had corrected him at least a dozen times over the 2 years they'd been neighbors. "I'm a captain, Gerald. The person who flies the plane." Gerald chuckled as if she'd told a joke. Right. You have a good day now, here." As she walked to her car, Jasmine's phone pinged with a text from her mother, "Fly safe today, baby. I'm so proud of you. Show those executives what excellence looks like." Jasmine smiled. Her mother always seemed to know when she needed encouragement. Today's flight wasn't just another day at the office. With airline executives on board, it was an opportunity to be visible, to represent not just herself but every black girl who dreamed of breaking into spaces where they weren't expected. She started her car and took a deep breath. Just another day, she whispered to herself, though she knew it rarely was. For Jasmine Washington, even the most routine flight came with the added weight of representation, of being the first, or the only, in rooms where people like her had historically been excluded. As she pulled out of her apartment complex, Jasmine turned up the radio and allowed herself a moment of simple joy. Whatever challenges today might bring, she would face them as she always did, with professionalism, excellence, and the unshakable determination that had carried her through every obstacle so far. Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport buzzed with its usual morning chaos as Jasmine navigated through the terminal. She'd opted to wear civilian clothes, dark jeans and a simple blouse, planning to change into her uniform closer to departure time. Experience had taught her that walking through public spaces in her captain's uniform often invited unwanted attention, questions, and occasionally hostility. She approached the security checkpoint, ID and crew badge in hand. Despite the dedicated crew lane, the TSA officer, a middle-aged white man with a buzz cut, scrutinized her credentials with unusual intensity. "This says Captain," he remarked, glancing between her face and her ID. "Yes, it does," Jasmine replied evenly, maintaining her professional demeanor. The officer held her gaze for a beat too long before reluctantly waving her through. "Have a nice flight," he muttered, his tone suggesting he found her position implausible. Jasmine collected her belongings without comment. These small indignities were part of her routine, as predictable as pre-flight checks. She'd learned to save her energy for battles that mattered. She made her way to the crew briefing room, where most of her team had already assembled. Travis spotted her immediately and waved her over with a smile. At 35, the white co-pilot had been flying with Jasmine for nearly 2 years and had become both a trusted colleague and ally. "Captain on deck," he announced as she approached, a gesture of respect that never failed to make her smile. The other crew members turned to greet her, some familiar faces and a few she hadn't worked with before. She didn't miss the flicker of surprise that crossed 2 of the new flight attendants' faces when they realized she was their captain. "Good morning, everyone," Jasmine began, her voice carrying the natural authority she'd worked hard to cultivate. "I'm Captain Washington. Before we get into today's briefing, let's do quick introductions for our new team members." The crew went around sharing names and positions. Kevin Chen, the lead flight attendant, was someone Jasmine had worked with many times. She was glad to have his experienced presence on this flight. "Now, let's talk about today's flight," Jasmine continued. "We're operating Flight 1382 to Chicago O'Hare. Boeing 737-800, full passenger load of 175, including some company executives in first class returning from the Regional Leadership Conference." She detailed the flight plan, weather conditions, and potential turbulence areas with precision. As the briefing concluded, she noticed 2 maintenance technicians who had entered the room exchange glances when she mentioned her role in handling an expected turbulence patch over the Appalachians. "You sure you can handle that, sweetheart?" one of them muttered to his colleague, just loud enough for her to hear. Before Jasmine could respond, Travis stepped in. "Captain Washington handled worse through a thunderstorm over the Rockies last month. Smoothest flight I've ever co-piloted through that kind of weather," he stated firmly. The technicians had the decency to look embarrassed as they handed over the maintenance log for Jasmine to review. After dismissing the crew to their preparations, Travis lingered behind. "You didn't have to do that," Jasmine said as she reviewed the aircraft's maintenance history. "I know you can fight your own battles," Travis replied. "But sometimes it's not about ability but about who should have to expend the energy. You shouldn't have to justify your competence every 5 minutes." Jasmine nodded appreciatively. "It's getting better, but some days." She trailed off. "Some days it's 1960 again," Travis offered. "Some days it feels like nothing's changed," she corrected. "But then I remember my flight school had 3 women and 1 black person, me. Now there are 5 black female captains at Atlantic. Still not enough, but progress." Their conversation was interrupted when Jasmine accidentally knocked over her coffee, spilling it on her uniform pants she'd just changed into. "Great," she sighed, looking at the spreading stain. "I've got a spare uniform in my locker," Travis offered. "Thanks, but wrong size, wrong gender, and definitely wrong look," Jasmine laughed. I've got my backup in my carry-on. I'll just change closer to boarding time. This minor inconvenience meant Jasmine would need to board the aircraft in civilian clothes and change in the onboard lavatory before taking command, a slight deviation from her usual routine, but nothing serious. As she was heading toward the gate, a man in an expensive suit barreled around the corner, bumping hard into her shoulder without stopping. "Watch where you're going," he snapped without looking back. Jasmine caught a glimpse of his first-class ticket and platinum frequent flyer tag. She had a feeling their paths would cross again on today's flight. With a deep breath, she continued toward gate C-22, mentally preparing for the day ahead, unaware of just how challenging it would become. Gate C-22 was a hive of activity as Jasmine approached. The boarding process for Flight 1382 to Chicago was already underway, with first-class passengers lining up at the priority lane. Jasmine spotted Kevin efficiently checking boarding passes while maintaining a warm smile. Atlantic Airways protocol required captains to board through the main cabin door along with passengers when not arriving directly from another flight. This procedure sometimes confused passengers who expected pilots to use a separate entrance, but it was standard practice for the airline. Jasmine queued in the first-class line, carry-on bag containing her uniform in tow. As she scanned her boarding pass and entered the jet bridge, she immediately recognized the man who had bumped into her earlier. Harold Bennett, according to the name he barked into his phone, was a well-dressed businessman in his 50s with an air of entitlement that seemed to expand beyond his personal space. "Absolutely unacceptable," he was saying loudly into his phone. "The presentation starts in 3 hours after we land, and these documents have errors all over them. Fix it before I land, or don't bother coming to the meeting." He ended his call with a jabbing motion and sighed dramatically, as if ensuring everyone around him knew of his importance and frustration. Jasmine maintained her composure as she followed the line of passengers onto the aircraft. Kevin greeted her with a subtle nod of recognition but maintained professional discretion, not acknowledging her as the captain in front of other passengers. "Good morning," he said evenly, the same greeting he offered to everyone. Harold had settled into seat 2A, spreading his belongings across both his assigned seat and the empty one beside it. When Jasmine approached her seat in 3C, his eyes flicked up and narrowed slightly. She stowed her bag in the overhead compartment and sat down, aware of Harold's gaze lingering on her. She was reaching for her seatbelt when his voice cut through the ambient noise of boarding. "Excuse me," he called out, not to her but to Kevin, who was helping an elderly passenger a few rows back. "Excuse me, flight attendant." Kevin approached with professional poise. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" Harold gestured toward Jasmine without looking at her. "When did Atlantic Airways change their policy on first-class seating? I paid a premium for this experience, and I'm noticing standards seem to be slipping." The implication in his tone was unmistakable. Kevin's smile remained fixed, but Jasmine could see tension creep into his shoulders. "Sir, all passengers in this cabin have first-class tickets. Everyone here belongs." "That's not my point," Harold said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm a Platinum Elite member with over 1 million miles. I'm just surprised at some of the choices being made about who gets upgraded these days." Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably. A woman across the aisle shot Harold a disgusted look, while the businessman next to her suddenly became intensely interested in his magazine. Jasmine remained silent, her face a carefully composed mask of indifference. This wasn't her first encounter with prejudice, and experience had taught her when to speak and when to let people reveal their own ugliness. "Sir," Kevin said, his voice lower but firm, "every passenger on this aircraft has been assigned their seat according to airline policy. I'd be happy to address any specific concerns about your seating arrangement, but I assure you everyone in first class has the appropriate ticket." Harold's face flushed slightly. "Fine. But when the real first-class passengers who've earned their status can't even get proper service because you're busy accommodating others, don't be surprised when business suffers." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the cabin. The woman across the aisle, Jasmine would later learn her name was Diana Miller, leaned forward. "Excuse me," Diana said, her voice carrying clearly, "but your concern sounds remarkably like prejudice to me. Perhaps you should focus on your presentation rather than who you think deserves to sit in which part of the plane." Harold's face reddened further. "I wasn't talking to you," he snapped. "No, you were talking about her," Diana replied, nodding toward Jasmine, loudly enough for everyone to hear. The tension in the cabin thickened as boarding continued. Jasmine checked her watch discreetly. In 10 minutes, she needed to be in the cockpit preparing for departure, but the situation was escalating in a way that might make that difficult. Harold was becoming more agitated, now openly complaining about reverse discrimination and how politics was ruining everything, even air travel. He repeatedly glanced at Jasmine, clearly expecting her to move or respond to his provocations. The final boarding announcement echoed through the cabin as the last group of passengers filed in. Jasmine knew she needed to make her way to the cockpit soon, but Harold had now positioned himself to block the aisle, ostensibly to retrieve something from his bag. "I need to speak to the captain," he announced to Kevin. "This is unacceptable." Kevin's professional demeanor wavered slightly as he realized the irony of the situation. "Sir, please take your seat. We need to prepare for departure." "Not until I speak with whoever's in charge," Harold insisted. "Either she goes to coach where she belongs, or I want to speak to management." The memory of a similar incident early in her career flashed through Jasmine's mind. She'd been a new first officer then, and had moved to another seat to avoid conflict, feeling humiliated but telling herself it wasn't worth delaying the flight. She had regretted that decision for years afterward, the quiet shame of not standing her ground burning far longer than the momentary discomfort would have. The boarding door closed with a definitive thunk. The flight could not depart without its captain, but the brewing confrontation threatened to create exactly the kind of scene Jasmine had always strived to avoid. Kevin discreetly pressed the interphone to alert the cockpit about the situation, unaware that the captain was sitting just feet away, watching everything unfold with measured calm and calculating her next move. The tension in the first-class cabin had reached a breaking point. Harold Bennett stood firmly in the aisle, his 6-foot frame creating an imposing barrier. His face had reddened to a dangerous shade of crimson, veins visible at his temples as he refused to back down. "I'm not moving until management addresses this situation," he declared loudly, gesturing toward Jasmine again. "I didn't pay extra for this kind of experience." Kevin maintained his professional composure, though his patience was visibly wearing thin. "Sir, please return to your seat. The captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign, and we need to prepare for departure." "That's precisely my point," Harold countered, voice rising. "We're delayed because standards have collapsed. She clearly doesn't belong here." His words had abandoned all subtlety now. "I can smell an upgrade passenger a mile away. People like her should know their place." The racist insinuation hung in the air like toxic fumes. Several passengers gasped. One man lowered his face into his hands, as if unable to bear witnessing such blatant prejudice. Diana Miller, the woman who had spoken up earlier, unfastened her seatbelt and stood. "That's enough," she said firmly. "Your behavior is inappropriate and offensive." "What exactly do you mean by people like her?" Harold scoffed. "I'm simply stating facts. Look at her. Does she look like she belongs in first class? I've worked too hard to have my experience diminished by diversity quotas." Kevin reached for the cabin phone, discreetly calling for backup. "Sir, I need to ask you one more time to return to your seat, or I'll have to involve the chief flight attendant." "Please do," Harold replied smugly. "I'd like to speak to someone with actual authority." Behind Harold, Jasmine could see his business associates squirming uncomfortably in their seats. They wore the same company lanyards and premium watches, but their expressions suggested they wanted no part in the scene their colleague was creating. Not one of them spoke up to stop him. Jasmine sat perfectly still, her mind racing through options. She could reveal her identity now and potentially defuse the situation, or she could follow protocol and let the cabin crew handle the passenger disruption before involving the captain formally. Her former flight instructor's words echoed in her mind, "As a black woman pilot, you'll face battles every day. Choose wisely which ones to fight directly. Sometimes letting people expose themselves is more powerful than any argument you could make." The chief flight attendant, Sofia Rodriguez, emerged from the galley, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, positioning herself between Harold and Kevin. "This gentleman has concerns about the seating arrangement," Kevin explained diplomatically. Harold cut in. "I have concerns about standards. I've been a loyal customer for 15 years, and I expect certain protocols to be maintained. Either she moves to her proper place, or I want to speak to the captain." Sophia's expression remained neutral, but her voice carried unmistakable authority. "Sir, all passengers have been assigned appropriate seats. I must ask you to return to yours immediately, or we will need to take further steps that may impact your travel plans today." "Are you threatening me?" Harold demanded incredulously. "Do you have any idea who I am? My company spends millions with this airline annually." "I'm not threatening you, sir. I'm informing you of our procedures," Sophia replied calmly. Harold looked around the cabin, seemingly expecting support from his fellow first-class passengers. Finding none, his frustration visibly increased. "This is ridiculous," he declared. "Either she goes, or I go. Make your choice." The ultimatum hung in the air. The departure time had already been pushed back by 10 minutes. In the cockpit, Travis would be wondering what was delaying his captain. Jasmine made her decision. With fluid grace, she reached into her pocket and withdrew her Atlantic Airways pilot ID and captain's wings. She stood, her movement drawing all eyes in the cabin. "Do you think Jasmine should have revealed her identity sooner, or was she right to wait until this moment?" Type 1 in the comments if you think she should have spoken up immediately, or 2 if you believe she made the right call to wait. And if you're enjoying this story of justice served, smash that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories like this one. Now, let's see how Harold reacts when he realizes the massive mistake he's just made. The cabin fell into stunned silence as Jasmine rose from her seat, ID and captain's wings glinting under the overhead lights. With deliberate calmness, she stepped into the aisle, facing Harold directly. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice clear and measured, "I believe you wanted to speak with the captain." Harold's expression transformed in phases, first confusion, then disbelief, followed by the dawning horror of realization. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound, like a fish suddenly pulled from water. The smugness that had dominated his features seconds ago evaporated, replaced by a pallor that made his earlier flush seem distant. "You're the captain?" he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Captain Jasmine Washington," she confirmed, displaying her credentials. "I'll be commanding your flight to Chicago today." The first-class cabin erupted in reactions. Diana Miller's face broke into a satisfied smile. An elderly gentleman in 4D began a slow, deliberate applause that several others joined. One of Harold's business associates seemed to physically shrink in his seat, while another suddenly became fascinated with his shoelaces. Sophia, the chief flight attendant, smoothly pivoted from conflict management to professional support. "Captain Washington, we apologize for the delay. Would you like me to prepare the cockpit notification?" "Thank you, Sophia," Jasmine replied with a nod. "I'll head up momentarily." Harold's complexion had progressed from pale to ashen. "I didn't. This isn't. There's been a misunderstanding," he stammered, his earlier confidence shattered. "I understand completely," Jasmine replied, her tone professional rather than accusatory. "Atlantic Airways has a boarding procedure where flight crew sometimes board through the main cabin door. I was about to change into my uniform before taking command of the aircraft." She gestured to her carry-on bag. My spare uniform is in there. I had a small accident with my coffee earlier. The humanizing detail somehow made Harold look even more mortified. This wasn't an anonymous target of his prejudice anymore, but a person with a coffee stain and a job to do, a job that happened to involve his safety and that of everyone on board. I apologize, he muttered, the words seemingly painful to extract. Before Jasmine could respond, the cockpit door opened, and Travis appeared, concern evident on his face. Everything all right out here? We're running behind schedule, he called, his eyes quickly finding Jasmine among the passengers. Just a small misunderstanding about seating arrangements, First Officer Reynolds, Jasmine replied. I'll be right there. Understanding dawned on Travis's face as he assessed the scene. Take your time, Captain. I've completed most of the pre-flight checks. The use of her title, spoken with natural respect by her white male colleague, seemed to drive home the reality of the situation to everyone in the cabin. Harold's associates were now visibly distancing themselves, shifting away in their seats and avoiding eye contact with him. One of them, a younger man with a Harvard Business School tie clip, leaned forward. Harold, for God's sake, sit down, he hissed. Jasmine turned back to Harold, who remained standing in the aisle, now the only obstacle to her reaching the cockpit and starting her job. Mr. Bennett, I need to prepare this aircraft for departure. Will you please take your seat? The formal request, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who commanded a multi-million-dollar aircraft for a living, seemed to break through Harold's paralysis. He moved aside mechanically, sliding back into 2A without further comment. As Jasmine retrieved her uniform bag from the overhead compartment, Diana Miller caught her eye. Captain, she said warmly, thank you for your service. I'm looking forward to a safe flight under your command. The simple acknowledgement, so routine for Jasmine's white male colleagues but so rare for her, brought an unexpected lump to Jasmine's throat. She nodded her appreciation and made her way toward the front lavatory to change. Internally, Jasmine was a storm of emotions, satisfaction at standing her ground, lingering anger at the humiliation she'd been subjected to, pride in her professionalism, and a bone-deep weariness at having to navigate yet another incident where her very presence in a space was questioned. But externally, she maintained the composed demeanor that her position demanded. In the confined space of the lavatory, as she changed into her crisp uniform with its 4 captain stripes, she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to process her feelings. Then, with practiced compartmentalization, she set the incident aside and turned her focus to the 175 lives that would soon be in her hands. When Jasmine emerged in full uniform, the transformation was complete. She walked the aisle with confident authority, nodding professionally to passengers who now looked at her with a mixture of respect, embarrassment, and in some cases, awe. As she passed row 2, Harold kept his eyes firmly fixed on his lap, but she could see his hands trembling slightly as he pretended to review documents. The power dynamic had been irrevocably shifted, not by anything Jasmine had said or done, but simply by the revelation of who she actually was. Stepping into the cockpit, Jasmine closed the door behind her and took a deep breath. Everything okay out there? Travis asked, genuine concern in his voice. Just another day at the office, Jasmine replied with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Let's get these people to Chicago. She settled into the captain's seat, her hands moving automatically through the familiar routine of checks and preparations. Here, in this space, her authority was unquestioned. Here, surrounded by instruments and procedures that responded to competence rather than color or gender, Jasmine Washington was exactly where she belonged. As Flight 1382 prepared for pushback, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin remained charged with the aftermath of the confrontation. Flight attendants moved through their safety demonstrations with professional efficiency, but the undercurrent of tension was palpable. Harold Bennett sat rigidly in 2A, his earlier bombast deflated into a careful stillness. When Kevin approached to verify that his seatbelt was fastened, Harold nodded without making eye contact, a sharp contrast to his previous demeanor. Just a little misunderstanding, he muttered, as if speaking the words might retroactively transform his actions into something benign. I would never have spoken that way if I'd known she was the captain. Kevin's smile remained professionally intact, but his eyes cooled several degrees. Of course, sir. Though I'm sure you wouldn't speak that way to any of our passengers, regardless of their position. The gentle rebuke landed precisely, causing Harold to shift uncomfortably in his seat. From the flight deck, Jasmine's voice came over the public address system, calm and authoritative. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Washington speaking. We're currently third in line for departure and should be airborne in approximately 15 minutes. Flight time to Chicago O'Hare will be 1 hour and 57 minutes. Weather conditions are clear here in Atlanta, with some light turbulence expected as we cross the Appalachian Mountains. Our flight attendants will provide service once we reach cruising altitude. On behalf of my first officer, Mr. Reynolds, and our entire cabin crew, we thank you for choosing Atlantic Airways." Her voice, now identified as belonging to the black woman Harold had tried to have removed, seemed to hang in the air long after the announcement ended. Several passengers glanced toward row 2, their expressions ranging from curiosity to judgment. As the aircraft began to push back from the gate, a distinguished woman in her 60s from row 1 unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. "Ma'am, you need to remain seated during pushback," Sophia reminded her promptly. "I understand. I'd just like to change seats if possible," the woman replied. She turned toward the chief flight attendant, but her voice carried deliberately. "I prefer not to sit near individuals who create hostile environments." With a quick scan of the cabin, Sophia nodded. "There's an available seat in 5B, Ms. Phillips." Harold's head snapped up at the name. "Sandra Phillips? From Atlantic Airways Corporate?" The woman paused, looking down at him with the cool assessment of someone well accustomed to evaluating personnel. "Yes, Mr. Bennett. Executive Vice President of Operations and Customer Experience." She offered no smile as she gathered her belongings. "I was at the same leadership conference you attended. I found your presentation on corporate values quite ironic given what I just witnessed." Harold blanched visibly. "Ms. Phillips, please, this was a misunderstanding." "If I'd known who she was, that's precisely the problem, isn't it?" Sandra interrupted, her voice low but cutting. "Your behavior shouldn't depend on someone's title, but on basic human respect." With that, she moved to her new seat, leaving Harold staring after her. One of Harold's associates leaned across the aisle. "You really stepped in it this time, Harold," he whispered urgently. "Phillips oversees our contract with Atlantic." The aircraft taxied toward the runway as Harold processed the expanding consequences of his actions. What had begun as an entitled outburst was now potentially threatening his company's relationship with a major client. In the cockpit, Jasmine and Travis worked through their pre-takeoff checklist with practiced efficiency. "V1, rotate," Travis called out as they reached takeoff speed. Jasmine pulled back on the yoke with precise pressure, guiding the aircraft into a smooth ascent. As the ground fell away beneath them, she felt the familiar sensation of leaving earthbound troubles behind, if only temporarily. Once they reached cruising altitude, Travis glanced over at her. "So, are we going to talk about what happened back there?" Jasmine adjusted a setting before responding. "Just another day of being a black female pilot in America." That was more than the usual skepticism, Travis noted. "That guy was straight up hostile. And now he's straight up terrified," Jasmine replied with a hint of a smile. "Did you see his face when I showed my ID? Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy," Travis chuckled, then grew serious. "But seriously, Jazz, are you okay? That kind of confrontation takes a toll, even when you come out on top." Jasmine appreciated his concern, but she'd long ago learned to process these incidents without letting them interfere with her performance. "I'm fine. Not the first, won't be the last. Let's focus on giving everyone a smooth flight to make up for the rocky start." Back in the cabin, the in-flight service had begun. Kevin and his team provided especially attentive service to Diana Miller and the other passengers who had supported Jasmine, a subtle but meaningful acknowledgement of their allyship. Harold, meanwhile, found himself the recipient of coolly professional but minimal interaction. No extra pillows, no friendly chat, just the basics delivered with impeccable but distant courtesy. Midway through the flight, he scribbled a note on an airline napkin and asked Kevin to deliver it to the cockpit. "I'd be happy to pass that along after we land, sir," Kevin replied. Company policy prohibits non-essential communications to the flight deck during operations. This wasn't strictly true. Brief, appropriate messages were sometimes delivered, but Kevin had made an executive decision about what constituted essential. As the plane encountered the predicted turbulence over the Appalachians, Jasmine demonstrated the skill that had earned her the left seat in the cockpit. Her adjustments to their course and altitude were so subtle that most passengers barely noticed the rough air, continuing their conversations and work without interruption. Jasmine thought of her father's advice from years ago, when she'd faced discrimination in flight school: "Excellence is the best revenge, Jazzy. Be so good they can't ignore you, so skilled they have to respect you, even if they don't want to." She'd lived by those words, becoming not just a pilot, but an exceptional one. The aircraft responded to her touch like a living thing, responding to her expertise regardless of her gender or race. "Nice handling," Travis commented as they emerged from the turbulent patch. "That bump would have had drinks and laps with most pilots I've flown with." "Just doing my job," Jasmine replied, though she allowed herself a moment of professional pride. Beneath them, Chicago was coming into view, the morning sun glinting off Lake Michigan as they began their initial descent. Despite the rocky start and the emotional weight of the confrontation, Jasmine felt a familiar sense of accomplishment. Whatever prejudice she faced on the ground, up here, in command of this sophisticated machine, her authority came from competence alone. The sky didn't care about the color of her skin or the gender on her birth certificate. Up here, she was simply Captain Washington, doing what she was born to do. At 37,000 feet, the Boeing 737-800 cruised smoothly toward Chicago. In the cockpit, Jasmine and Travis monitored the aircraft systems while maintaining communication with air traffic control. The confrontation in the cabin now seemed distant, sealed behind the secure cockpit door, but its emotional aftereffects lingered. "Want to talk about what happened back there?" Travis asked, breaking a comfortable silence between them. Jasmine adjusted her heading slightly before responding. "Not much to say. Just another day of being visibly black in a traditionally white male space." "That was extreme, even by the usual standards of ignorance," Travis observed. "Most people just do a double take or ask dumb questions. That guy was outright hostile." "True," Jasmine acknowledged. "But honestly, sometimes I prefer the overt stuff to the subtle kind. At least with him, the prejudice was right on the surface. It's the quiet doubters who smile to your face while questioning your competence behind your back that are harder to address." Travis nodded thoughtfully. "I can't imagine dealing with that every day." "It's exhausting," Jasmine admitted. "But days like today remind me why visibility matters. Maybe the next black girl who wants to be a pilot won't hear 'you can't' quite as often because people like me keep showing up in these spaces." Their conversation paused as Jasmine made a perfect course correction, compensating for unexpected crosswinds with such skill that passengers would never notice the adjustment. "Speaking of showing up," Travis said, "that takeoff was textbook perfect. Even with the emotional baggage of that confrontation, you nailed it." Jasmine allowed herself a small smile. "My father always said excellence is the best response to doubt. If I'm going to be scrutinized anyway, might as well give them perfection to look at." Back in the main cabin, the atmosphere remained charged. In first class, Harold Bennett sat rigidly in his seat, the gravity of his situation becoming increasingly apparent. Not only had he publicly humiliated himself, but he'd done so in front of Sandra Phillips, an executive whose approval his company needed to maintain their lucrative contract with Atlantic Airways. Sandra had moved to a seat several rows back but remained visible from Harold's position. She was now engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with one of the flight attendants, occasionally glancing in Harold's direction. Diana Miller, who had defended Jasmine during the confrontation, was receiving notably warm service from the cabin crew. When she requested a coffee, Kevin brought her the freshly brewed pot from first class rather than the standard offering from the main cabin cart. "Thank you for speaking up earlier," Kevin said quietly as he poured her coffee. "It means a lot to our crew when passengers stand against that kind of behavior." Diana nodded. "I couldn't stay silent. My daughter is in aviation school, hoping to be a pilot someday. She faces enough barriers without people like him adding to them." Harold was painfully aware of the cold shoulder he was receiving. When he pressed his call button, the response was professionally correct but lacking any warmth. No friendly conversation, no extra pillows or blankets offered, just the minimum service required by protocol. Midway through the flight, he scribbled a note on an airline cocktail napkin: "Captain Washington, I sincerely apologize for my inexcusable behavior. I made assumptions that were both wrong and offensive. Please accept my deepest regrets." Harold Bennett he signaled Kevin, who approached with visible reluctance. "Could you please make sure the captain gets this?" Harold asked, handing over the folded napkin. "All communications to the flight deck must go through proper channels, sir," Kevin replied coolly. "I'll ensure she receives it after we land." The note remained in Kevin's pocket, his personal judgment deeming it non-essential communication during flight operations. As the plane continued toward Chicago, Harold's thoughts turned increasingly to damage control. His company, Bennett Logistics Solutions, had a $5 million annual contract with Atlantic Airways that was up for renewal next quarter. Sandra Phillips was on the committee that would make that decision. He glanced back at her, hoping to catch her eye and perhaps communicate silent contrition, but she was now deeply engaged with her laptop, pointedly ignoring his existence. One of his colleagues leaned across the aisle. "HR is going to have a field day with this, Harold." That was textbook discrimination, and there were about 20 witnesses. Harold loosened his tie slightly, feeling a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with altitude. The aircraft encountered a patch of moderate turbulence, causing the seatbelt sign to illuminate with a soft chime. Harold gripped his armrests, his knuckles whitening as the plane bounced through rough air. Then, almost as quickly as it had begun, the turbulence subsided. The plane stabilized, continuing its smooth journey as if the rough patch had never happened. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Washington," came Jasmine's steady voice over the intercom. "As you experienced, we encountered some turbulence, which is common when crossing the weather system currently over the Midwest. We've adjusted our altitude to provide a smoother ride, and you can expect clear conditions for the remainder of our journey to Chicago. We're approximately 45 minutes from landing at O'Hare International." Harold could feel eyes on him from around the cabin as Jasmine's voice, confident and professional, filled the space. The unspoken message seemed clear to everyone. The woman he had tried to have removed from first class was now ensuring his safety through technical expertise and years of training. In the cockpit, Jasmine completed her announcement and returned to monitoring their flight path. She thought of her father's words from years ago, advice that had carried her through flight school and beyond: "When they go low, you fly high," literally and figuratively. As a child, she'd laughed at his aviation puns. As an adult, she'd found profound wisdom in his guidance. Excellence was indeed the most powerful response to prejudice. While Harold Bennett squirmed in discomfort back in first class, she was exactly where she belonged, in command of a sophisticated aircraft, responsible for the safety of everyone on board, regardless of their attitude toward her. Travis handed her a cup of coffee. "For what it's worth, I thought you handled that situation better than most people would have. No shouting, no drama, just quiet dignity and letting your position speak for itself." Jasmine accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "Sometimes the best response is just being undeniably good at what you do," she replied. Though I won't pretend it didn't feel satisfying to see his face when he realized who I was. They shared a smile as Chicago's skyline became visible in the distance, the morning sun glinting off Lake Michigan's surface. Despite the turbulent start to the journey, both meteorologically and metaphorically, they were approaching their destination safely and on schedule. In that moment, Jasmine felt a complex mixture of emotions, lingering frustration at having to constantly prove herself, satisfaction at standing her ground, and a quiet pride in her professionalism. But most of all, she felt the simple joy of doing what she loved, flying, despite all the barriers that had been placed in her path. As they began their initial descent into O'Hare, Jasmine pushed thoughts of Harold Bennett aside. The incident would make for a story later, perhaps even a teaching moment in the diversity workshops she occasionally led for new pilots. But for now, her focus was where it needed to be, on bringing Flight 1382 and all its passengers safely to the ground. Atlantic 1382, O'Hare approach, the air traffic controller's voice crackled through the headset. Be advised we're experiencing rapidly deteriorating conditions. Visibility dropping with unexpected fog rolling in from the lake. Wind shear reported on final approach to runway 27R. Jasmine exchanged a quick glance with Travis. What had been forecasted as clear conditions for their arrival had suddenly become complicated. Roger that, O'Hare approach. Atlantic 1382 requesting updated weather report and approach instructions, Jasmine responded calmly. The controller provided the latest meteorological data, visibility down to 3/4 of a mile, crosswinds at 20 knots gusting to 30, and a rapid temperature drop causing fog to form unpredictably across the airfield. Looks like Chicago's famous weather mood swings are in full effect today, Travis commented as they began reprogramming their approach. Let's run the severe weather landing checklist, Jasmine directed, her tone shifting to focused precision. And let's inform the cabin crew to prepare for a potentially rough approach. As Travis made the call to the cabin, Jasmine mentally rehearsed the approach procedures for these conditions. The original forecast had called for clear skies, but Chicago's proximity to Lake Michigan made weather notoriously unpredictable. These sudden changes were exactly why airlines paid a premium for experienced captains who could handle unexpected challenges. In the cabin, Kevin's voice came over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your lead flight attendant speaking. We've been informed by Captain Washington that we may experience some turbulence during our approach into Chicago due to changing weather conditions. Please return to your seats, fasten your seatbelt securely, and ensure all loose items are stowed." The passengers, who had been preparing for a routine landing, now shifted nervously in their seats. In first class, Harold Bennett gripped his armrests tightly, his earlier concerns about his professional reputation temporarily overshadowed by more immediate anxiety about the flight conditions. Diana Miller, watching from her seat, noticed how the cabin crew moved with practiced efficiency, their faces betraying no concern as they secured the cabin for landing. Their confidence in their captain was evident in every smooth movement and reassuring smile. Sandra Phillips, the airline executive, observed everything with a professional eye, making mental notes about how the crew handled the situation. Back in the cockpit, a warning light illuminated on the instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure fluctuation in System B, Travis reported, his voice remaining steady despite the significance of the alert. Jasmine quickly assessed the readings. Initiating secondary hydraulic pump. Let's run the hydraulic anomaly checklist. The two pilots worked in synchronized precision, each handling their responsibilities while maintaining clear communication. The hydraulic issue, while not immediately dangerous, added another layer of complexity to an already challenging approach. Atlantic 1382, be advised aircraft ahead of you reporting moderate to severe turbulence on final approach, the controller updated them. Roger that, Jasmine acknowledged. Atlantic 1382 is prepared for turbulent conditions. She made a quick decision. Travis, make an announcement. Passengers should expect a rough approach. I'm going to focus on hand flying this one. Travis nodded, understanding immediately. In challenging conditions like these, Jasmine preferred to manually fly the aircraft rather than rely on the autopilot. It was a skill she had mastered to an exceptional degree, her touch on the controls responsive yet gentle, reading the aircraft's feedback like a conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Reynolds from the flight deck," Travis announced. "Captain Washington has advised that our approach into Chicago may be bumpy due to weather conditions. This is nothing to be concerned about, but please remain in your seats with seatbelts fastened even if the turbulence temporarily subsides." In the cabin, passengers exchanged nervous glances. Harold, who had spent the flight avoiding eye contact with those around him, now found himself irrationally fixated on the fact that the pilot he had disrespected and tried to have removed was now responsible for guiding them safely through dangerous conditions. The aircraft began its descent through cloud cover, immediately encountering the predicted turbulence. The plane bucked and shuddered as competing air currents buffeted it from multiple directions. Jasmine's hands moved constantly, making tiny adjustments to maintain their descent path while compensating for the unpredictable air movements. Her face remained composed in concentration, years of training and experience evident in every precise movement. "Wind shear alert," the automated system warned as they descended through 3,000 feet. "I have control," Jasmine confirmed, increasing power slightly to maintain their glide path as the crosswinds intensified. Through breaks in the cloud cover, passengers could see Chicago appearing and disappearing below them, the visibility fluctuating with the swirling fog. The plane dropped suddenly, eliciting gasps from throughout the cabin, before Jasmine smoothly corrected their descent angle. "Hydraulic pressure continuing to fluctuate," Travis reported. "Still within operational parameters, but trending toward the lower limit." Jasmine nodded without taking her eyes off the instruments and the rapidly approaching runway. "Noted. Let's plan for a firm landing rather than a greaser. I want maximum brake effectiveness with the questionable hydraulics." As they broke through the final layer of cloud cover at 1,000 feet, O'Hare's runway 27R became visible, then disappeared again behind a bank of fog, then reappeared. The crosswinds pushed against the aircraft, requiring Jasmine to employ the crab technique, pointing the nose into the wind while maintaining a straight ground track toward the runway. 500 feet, Travis called out, reading the radar altimeter. "Runway in sight but visibility decreasing." "Landing gear confirmed down and locked," Jasmine responded, feeling the aircraft fighting her as she maintained their approach path through the turbulent air. The final approach became a masterclass in precision flying. Jasmine made constant adjustments, feeling the aircraft's responses through the controls as an extension of her own body. Each gust of wind was met with immediate compensation, each drop in air density countered with power adjustments. 200 feet, 100, 50, 30. Travis counted down their altitude above the runway. At the perfect moment, Jasmine executed the decrab maneuver, aligning the aircraft with the runway centerline just as the main landing gear touched down with firm precision. The reverse thrusters engaged as she maintained perfect directional control despite the gusting crosswinds. The passengers felt the solid contact with the ground and the powerful deceleration as the aircraft slowed rapidly on the wet runway. Within moments, the heart-stopping approach was complete, the aircraft safely on the ground and taxiing toward the terminal. A spontaneous round of applause erupted in the cabin, the nervous energy of the challenging approach finding release in collective appreciation for the skill that had brought them safely to Earth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kevin announced, unable to keep a note of pride from his voice, "welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Local time is 10:47 a.m., and the temperature is a chilly 42 degrees with foggy conditions. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft has come to a complete stop at the gate and the captain has turned off the seatbelt sign." He paused before adding, "On behalf of Captain Washington and our entire crew, we thank you for choosing Atlantic Airways." The emphasis on the captain's name was subtle but unmistakable, particularly to those in first class who had witnessed the earlier confrontation. Harold Bennett sat motionless in his seat, the reality of the situation fully dawning on him. The woman he had tried to have removed from first class had just skillfully guided a commercial aircraft through dangerous conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. Her competence hadn't just been proven, it had potentially saved lives. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Sandra Phillips made notes on her tablet, occasionally glancing toward the cockpit door. Diana Miller smiled quietly to herself, imagining how she would tell this story to her daughter studying aviation. In the cockpit, Jasmine completed the necessary post-landing procedures with Travis, her movements precise despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. That, Travis said with quiet admiration, was some of the finest hand flying I've ever witnessed. That crosswind component was well beyond what most pilots would be comfortable handling. Jasmine allowed herself a small smile of professional satisfaction. Thanks. Felt good to actually use all those simulator hours in real conditions. As they taxied to the gate, Jasmine's thoughts briefly returned to the confrontation that had started their journey. The irony wasn't lost on her, that the skills Harold Bennett had assumed she couldn't possibly possess had just ensured his safe arrival. It wasn't about vindication, she decided. It was about excellence speaking for itself in a language that even prejudice couldn't deny. The seatbelt sign dinged off as Flight 1382 settled at Gate B-17. Passengers began the familiar ritual of gathering belongings and forming the impatient queue in the aisle, the challenging landing already becoming an anecdote for later conversations. Jasmine completed her shutdown checklist and stood, straightening her uniform before stepping out of the cockpit. Atlantic Airways protocol required captains to stand by the exit door as passengers deplaned, a tradition of hospitality and responsibility that Jasmine particularly valued today. "Nice flying, Captain," Travis said with genuine admiration as they prepared to exit. "That approach deserves to be in a textbook." Jasmine smiled, the professional acknowledgement meaning more to her than any revenge against Harold Bennett ever could. As she took her position by the door, Jasmine maintained the warm but dignified demeanor expected of an Atlantic Airways captain. "Thank you for flying with us today," she said to each departing passenger, her voice carrying the same confidence that had guided them safely through turbulent skies. Many passengers paused to offer specific thanks for the skillful landing. An elderly woman clasped Jasmine's hand between both of hers. 40 years of flying, dear, and that's the first time I've felt truly safe during a rough approach." Diana Miller stopped directly in front of Jasmine, speaking quietly so only those nearby could hear. "My daughter is in her second year at Embry-Riddle. She's one of 3 women in her program. I'm going to tell her about you tonight." Jasmine felt a tightness in her throat. "Tell her to reach out if she ever needs advice. Atlantic Airways has a mentorship program." As the cabin gradually emptied, Harold Bennett remained seated, his focus entirely on his phone, clearly hoping to avoid another encounter. His colleagues filed past with embarrassed nods, distancing themselves from his earlier behavior. Sandra Phillips, the airline executive, was one of the last to approach the exit. She paused beside Jasmine. "Exceptional handling of both aircraft and situation, Captain Washington," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach the front rows. "I'd like a word with you after you've completed your duties, if you have a moment." "Of course, Miss Phillips," Jasmine replied. Finally, only Harold remained, still pretending absorption in his phone. With the cabin empty, he had no choice but to gather his belongings and approach the exit. He kept his eyes downcast as he neared Jasmine. "Mr. Bennett," Sandra Phillips's voice cut through the awkward silence. She had remained in the jet bridge, apparently waiting for this exact moment. "A moment of your time, please." Harold froze, caught between Jasmine and Sandra. His face cycled through several emotions before settling into resigned discomfort. "Ms. Phillips, I want to apologize for my behavior earlier," he began, his voice lacking the confidence that had characterized his earlier demands. "It was completely inappropriate and doesn't reflect my usual standards of conduct." "I believe Captain Washington is the one owed that apology," Sandra replied coolly. Harold turned to Jasmine, finally making eye contact. Captain Washington, I sincerely apologize for my inexcusable behavior. There's no justification for how I acted. Jasmine measured her response carefully. This moment wasn't just about Harold's redemption, it was about setting expectations for how she and others like her deserved to be treated. Mr. Bennet, she began, I accept your apology, but I'd like you to understand something. The issue wasn't that you failed to recognize me as the captain. The issue was that you believed someone who looked like me didn't belong in first class at all. Harold flinched slightly at the direct confrontation of his prejudice. What you experienced afterward, Jasmine continued, the embarrassment, the discomfort of being judged by your behavior rather than your appearance, that's something many people live with every day. I hope today's experience might change how you see others in spaces where you don't expect to find them. Before Harold could respond, Sandra interjected. Bennett Logistics has been a contractor for Atlantic Airways for 5 years now, Mr. Bennet. Harold's expression shifted to alarm. Yes, and we've always valued the relationship, a relationship that depends on shared values, Sandra interrupted. Our company has made diversity and inclusion central to our corporate identity. Not as window dressing, but as fundamental principles. I completely support those values, Harold insisted, perspiration visible on his forehead despite the cool air from the jet bridge. Actions speak louder than words, Mr. Bennet, Sandra replied. When we review contracts, we consider not just the services provided but the corporate culture of our partners. She handed him a business card. My office will be contacting your CEO tomorrow to discuss recent events and our expectations moving forward. Harold stared at the card, the full business implications of his behavior now unavoidably clear. For what it's worth, he said quietly, seeing Captain Washington handle that landing, it was incredible. I've never felt safer, despite the conditions. Competence has never been determined by color or gender, Mr. Bennet, Jasmine responded. But recognition of that competence often is. Thank you for acknowledging it now. With a final nod of acknowledgement, Harold continued down the jet bridge, the set of his shoulders conveying the weight of the day's lessons. Once he was out of earshot, Sandra turned to Jasmine. I've been pushing for policy changes regarding passenger conduct for months. Today's incident provides the perfect case study for why we need stronger protocols. I'm just glad it ended without further escalation, Jasmine replied diplomatically. Ended? Sandra raised an eyebrow. Captain Washington, I think this is just the beginning. 3 months later, Jasmine stood before a classroom of aspiring pilots at the Atlantic Airways Flight Academy. The room was noticeably more diverse than when she had trained there years earlier, still predominantly white and male, but with significantly more women and people of color than her cohort had included. Aviation has always been about overcoming forces that try to keep you grounded, she told the students. Gravity is just the most obvious one. Laughter rippled through the room. The challenges you'll face will be technical, physical, and sometimes social, Jasmine continued. Each of you will encounter different obstacles, but I'm here to tell you that the view from the captain's chair is worth every moment of the journey. In the back of the classroom, a young black girl of about 12 sat beside her mother, Diana Miller, who had reached out after their memorable flight to ask if her daughter could attend the talk. Afterward, as the formal session ended and students gathered around Jasmine with questions, the young girl approached hesitantly. Ms. Washington. I'm Zoe. I want to be a pilot too, but people at school say girls aren't good at math and science. Jasmine knelt to meet Zoe at eye level. When I was your age, people told me the same thing. But here's a secret, flying isn't just about math and science. It's about judgment, focus, and determination. And from the questions you asked during the talk, I can tell you have plenty of all three. Zoe's face brightened. Really? Really, Jasmine confirmed. And now, there's a mentorship program for young women interested in aviation. Would you like me to tell you about it? As Jasmine explained the program to an increasingly excited Zoe, she noticed a familiar figure enter the back of the classroom, Harold Bennet, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the unfamiliar setting. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and he gave a small, respectful nod. Jasmine had heard that Bennett Logistics had indeed renewed their contract with Atlantic Airways, but with new conditions including mandatory diversity training for all executives. Harold, as she now understood, was fulfilling part of that requirement by attending aviation industry inclusion events. Later that evening, as Jasmine prepared for her next flight, this time to San Francisco, she reflected on the turbulent journey that had brought her to this moment. The incident with Harold Bennett had been challenging, but its aftermath had created ripples of positive change throughout Atlantic Airways and beyond. The airline had implemented new passenger conduct policies with clear consequences for discriminatory behavior. The mentorship program for underrepresented groups in aviation had received additional funding. And Jasmine herself had been featured in the company's recruitment materials, becoming a visible symbol of the changing face of commercial aviation. As she donned her captain's uniform, Jasmine ran her fingers across the 4 gold stripes on her epaulets, symbols of achievement that had been earned through years of excellence, regardless of the additional barriers placed in her path. Tomorrow, she would command another flight, guiding passengers safely through the skies with the same skill and professionalism she brought to every journey. Some passengers would still do a double-take upon seeing her in the cockpit. Some might still question her capabilities behind her back. But as her father had wisely told her years ago, excellence speaks a language that even prejudice must eventually acknowledge. And today, Captain Jasmine Washington was flying higher than ever. This powerful story reminds us that prejudice often stems from assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces. Jasmine's experience shows that excellence truly is the most powerful response to discrimination. Rather than lowering herself to Harold's level through anger or retaliation, she maintained her dignity and let her professional competence speak for itself. The story also highlights how privilege can blind people to their own biases. Harold didn't recognize his prejudice until he was forced to confront it directly. His journey from entitled discrimination to genuine realization demonstrates that meaningful change requires more than just fear of consequences, it demands honest self-reflection. Perhaps most importantly, this narrative shows the ripple effect of representation. Jasmine's presence as a black female captain not only challenged Harold's worldview but also inspired young Zoe to pursue her dreams despite societal discouragement. When we stand firm in spaces where others say we don't belong, we create pathways for those who will follow. True change happens not just through policies and training, but through personal encounters that challenge our assumptions about what leadership, competence, and authority look like. Have you ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you based on your appearance? How did you respond? Share your experience in the comments below. Has someone ever stood up for you when you faced discrimination, like Diana did for Jasmine? Or have you been that ally for someone else? We'd love to hear your stories. If this tale of overcoming racism and proving your worth inspired you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful racism stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that excellence is the ultimate answer to prejudice. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the best response to those who try to keep you down is to soar higher than they ever thought possible. See you in our next incredible true story.